Good morning. My name is Jackie Anderson, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the University of St. Thomas and our fall online learning series. Now, if you had a chance to attend this summer, you know the purpose of each one of these sessions is to give you a chance to start your day with a dose of learning, as well as giving us the opportunity to showcase some of the great faculty that teach here at the University of St. Thomas. Now, this is the second in a series of 3 sessions this fall. Our next session is December 11th, and it's on planning in the era of emerging technology with Michael Wright. So if you don't have that on your calendar, please put it on your calendar. Now, today's session is Agile Project Management with Wayne Kaul, and I'm going to give Wayne a more formal introduction in a few minutes. But Wayne actually teaches our Agile Project Management course, our mini masters in project management, our PMP test prep course, and we're launching a new program next week called the Accidental Project Manager. So if you haven't been to our website, take a look. We offer over 30 open enrollment courses that can help support your professional development. We hope to see you here at the University of St. Thomas. So with that, let me start with some logistics. Today, I'm going to introduce Wayne in a minute, and he'll speak for about 45 minutes on the topic of Agile Project Management. Now, we're going to try to reserve questions for the end. So if you do have questions that come up during the presentation, feel free to just put them in the online chat, and we will be tallying those questions and asking them at the end. As is our tradition, we're going to try to end about 5 minutes before the hour. So if you need to get another cup of coffee or get to your next meeting, you'll have a chance to do that. So with that, I'm going to introduce today's speaker. I have the privilege of introducing Wayne Kaul. Wayne actually has been teaching here at St. Thomas for over 7 years. Prior to joining St. Thomas's adjunct faculty, he was an executive that worked in product engineering, IT, as well as R&D. He has a BA in information technology, an MBA in decision sciences. He is a certified project management professional, or a PMP, and he's also an Agile certified practitioner. So between the BA, the MBA, the PMP, and the PMI ACP, I think it's time to turn it over. It's my privilege to welcome Wayne Kaul. Thanks for joining us today, Wayne.
Thank you very much, Jackie. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to everyone who's connecting with us today. As Jackie mentioned, I'm Wayne Kaul. I've been with the University of St. Thomas for a little over 7 years, and I get the honor of teaching in all of the project management programs, but it's just a great opportunity to be a part of executive education here at the university. And so we're here today to discuss the topic of Agile project management, and this is an approach that's really taken the project management world by storm. The application of these Agile project management classes has led to dramatic improvements in project success rates by doing things like reducing budget overruns and reducing project delays and reducing project abandonment. And these Agile methods evolved as a result of the real-world experience of software developers as they were trying to apply traditional project management techniques to their knowledge-based projects. Now, I also want to note here that even though Agile project management evolved from software development, it's not limited to that field or domain. The application of these techniques in project management has expanded to a broad variety of industries and project types. So I think it's safe to say that in today's fast-changing world, where we often have to respond and react to technology changes and business changes, Agile project management is delivering results whether we're working in a software field or not. So in its simplest form, Agile project management is a lightweight framework for helping teams maintain focus on the rapid delivery of business value. And by maintaining this focus, organizations are capable of reducing the overall level of risk that's typically associated with new product development and project management. In addition, the Agile project teams are better able to align their delivered project with business needs and requirements. And last but not least, the Agile project teams are better able to respond to changing requirements at any point in the project lifecycle. The result of all of these is that we wind up with a product, system, or service that more effectively meets the needs of our customers, and we have teams that have a level of responsiveness that can lead to competitive advantage for the customers. So the goal of the next 45 minutes is to give a high-level overview of the subject to help you prepare for the likely case of encountering Agile project management at your place of business. Now, this next slide is here to provide credit for several of the images that will be used in this presentation. The author of the book, Essential Scrum, is Ken Rubin, and he's granted this permission. He's also been instrumental in helping me put together the courseware here at the University of St. Thomas. I want to thank him for that. So when I teach this Agile project management class at the University of St. Thomas, I typically find that there's a broad range of experience in the classroom and the audience. And I'm guessing that's also the case for those of you connecting with us today. And so while I can't cover all the subjects in Agile project management today, I think that there would be value in covering these 3 items. I'd like to start with a high-level introduction of Agile concepts and maybe do a comparison between Agile and traditional project management or waterfall techniques. I'd also like to talk about the values and principles of Agile because they play a significant role in implementing Agile successfully. And last but not least, I want to talk about putting those principles into practice. And so we'll talk about 2 of the more popular methods of putting the Agile practices into place. I want to start with the Simon Sinek model of starting with why. And my first why today is, why would we need another project management methodology? Maybe you and your colleagues are wondering, why can't all projects simply be run with a standardized methodology, and why can't there be one? Or maybe you're asking, why would I need Agile project management methodologies when traditional methods are already out there? Well, my answer is that different methodologies are needed because there's no single one-size-fits-all approach in project management. So for example, we know that when you can clearly visualize the outcome of a project and you have clear boundaries and clear requirements and very clear definition, well, those types of projects are easier to plan and the outcomes are easier to predict. And traditional and waterfall project management will work just fine there, just great in those situations. But an increasing number of projects today involve more complex work involving knowledge-based projects, knowledge creation and collaborations. These are projects that have less clarity in their objectives and their outcomes. These types of projects require that we move ahead with more of a one step at a time approach, and it means that we have to work in smaller increments and iterations and see where we're at and be able to react and change quickly as needed. These are the types of projects that are best suited for Agile project management. Now, a little bit earlier, I used the term traditional or waterfall project management, so I'd like to give you a few visuals on what's really going on with that. And I'd like to start by saying this waterfall method is primarily a sequential development process where its progress is seen as flowing steadily through feasibility, planning, designing, building, and you see the rest. The waterfall development process was originated in the manufacturing and construction industries that were very highly structured environments, and project changes were difficult, if not impossible, to make. So success with waterfall project management required a near perfect understanding of requirements at the beginning of the project and a minimal number of errors or changes as we went through each one of those phases. Now, since that approach had worked well in manufacturing and construction industries, it seemed logical that when more and more of these knowledge-based applications and software development projects were emerging in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it seemed logical, since this had worked in those other areas, that we would try this approach for software development. But here's the story. When software developers started using this approach for their knowledge-based projects, they actually found that this approach hurt their projects pretty significantly. Let's take a look at this through a slightly different lens that might help explain that. As you can see this maybe a little bit better here. The traditional approach treats planning, designing, and building as discrete phases in a project. And I mentioned that the software developers were finding issues with this. So some of the things that they found started with the idea that since they really didn't have a working product, system, or service until the very end, it was difficult to understand where they were in a waterfall project management process. This might be the main reason that the last 20% of your project always seems to take 80% of the time. They also found that there was greater risk when they were using this approach. They had, first of all, schedule risk, because you really never knew if you were going to make it until the very end. There was technical risk, because you didn't get a chance to test your architecture or your design until late in the project. And you also had product risk, because you really never knew if you were building the right thing until it was too late to make any of those changes. And finally, if any of those early phases of planning, designing, building, if any of those phases run longer than anticipated and the project starts to run out of time and money, the only thing that you can adjust is testing. And when you cut testing short, quality can suffer. And I'm willing to bet that most of the project managers that are joining us today and connected with us have seen some of these same severe issues by having their testing and the quality elements of their project get squeezed. But it's very common for us in this type of environment to see defects and quality issues increase because we've cut testing short. It's likely that cost will increase because more than likely your team is working overtime to try and line up with this reduced testing time. And you also run the risk of having team members leave and turnover increasing because of longer hours and pressure and stress. So let's back this off a little bit. Now let's compare this with Agile practices. Instead of treating each one of these as distinct phases, as we did with the waterfall method, Agile practitioners look at this differently. They see these as continuous and ongoing iterative activities. And by doing each one of these steps iteratively, going from planning through design and testing, doing them iteratively throughout the project, we take a slice of the project and perform all of these functions. We repeat that cycle through the life of the project. And when we do this, we find that quality improves because testing started almost from day one. Visibility to your product, system, or service increases because you're showing tangible results after each one of those cycles. And risk is reduced because you're getting feedback early, and customers are happier because they can make changes without getting charged exorbitant prices for those changes. Now, as software developers were starting to experiment with these approaches, several different ideas were being tossed around and discussed and adopted. And a group of these practitioners got together in Snowbird, Utah in 2001. And they wrote something called the Agile Manifesto that we're going to be talking about in just a little bit. But remember, at the time, the folks who wrote the manifesto were focused on the early and continuous delivery of software. And the reason that I bring that up is it's no secret that Agile is being used and is very well adopted in the software development area, but its use has been expanding beyond software development. There's a growing number of project management and business experts who are now recommending that you use Agile for a number of non-software projects, and that includes marketing and market research and product development and process improvement initiatives, learning and development, publishing, recruiting, and the list goes on and on and on. So that the use of Agile, even in these non-software environments, is leading to higher ROI, reduced risks, increased project control, higher product quality, and most importantly, higher customer satisfaction. So my reason for pointing out the Agile Manifesto is we're going to see in just a little bit that there's going to be several elements of the manifesto that talk about software development, but I want you to keep in mind that its use has expanded significantly since 2001. Now, earlier, I've used the term waterfall and Agile, and I said that different types of projects require different types of methods. And you might be asking now, where do waterfall and Agile projects best fit? Well, that's a great question. That's good information to have, because once you assess your project against the right criteria, then you can decide on the best approach and methodology to use. So to help us with this, we can use the Stacy complexity model to help us select the appropriate project management technique based on two dimensions: the degree of certainty in our technology and also the level of agreement on the needs and requirements, essentially thinking about what we have to do and how we're going to do it. So those traditional approaches are going to work well for straightforward and sometimes the projects that have low complexity, where we can have a well-defined plan with clearly defined tasks and well-understood requirements. And this is the best spot for traditional project management. But Agile approaches are a much better fit for more complex projects and maybe even the edge of chaos, where we need to take a little bit of the plan, execute it, and then see where we are and adjust your plans accordingly. So thinking about this model can help you identify where traditional or Agile practices might be the most effective. So this clarifies a little bit of the differences between traditional and Agile methods, where each one fits. And now I'd like to start discussing the values and the principles associated with Agile project management. And this will be important if you're considering the use of Agile at your place of business, because implementing Agile can be challenging because it involves change. And change, as we all know, can be difficult. And that's because a successful transition to Agile is a change that requires both top-down and bottom-up buy-in and commitment. It's also hard because the approach to Agile is dramatically different. We're asking people to work in ways that are unfamiliar and ways that run counter to their training and experience. And we all know that that can lead to hesitation and resistance to change. And finally, this change to Agile is pervasive, meaning that it's going to affect a lot of people in your organization. It's not just a small set of practices that can be easy to ignore. Changes caused by Agile might extend to other parts of the company. It might impact your sales organization about how they communicate data and scope and project commitments. It might even impact finance regarding capital and expense considerations. And with more groups and with more people that would be affected by a move to Agile, there's more opportunity for resistance to change and misunderstandings. So as the author Mike Cohn would say, changing practices is one thing, changing minds is another. So that's where some perspective on Agile values and principles will come in as you're starting to think about a move to Agile in your environment. And one of the ways that this is discussed as folks are thinking about this move to Agile is called the difference between doing Agile and being Agile. So let's take a look at this diagram and break it down just a little bit. I'd like to start off by saying that Agile is a mindset. It's a mentality that's defined by values, and it's guided by principles, and it's manifested through many different practices. So to apply this idea, the best way to adopt Agile is shown by the green arrow on the left. In this case, we're starting by recognizing the Agile mentality and then using that understanding to select and implement the practices that we're going to use. And when we start with a good understanding of why we're following this practice, it helps us understand the how in which practices are going to help us move forward. The red arrow on the right is representing the idea of doing Agile. This is representing a team or a company that is just starting to adopt a couple of Agile practices without understanding the strategies involved. In this case, they're just jumping straight to the how of doing Agile without understanding the why. This is a very common problem in Agile adoption, and it's also one of the most frequently mentioned causes for Agile project failure. The point is this: successful Agile implementations do more than just throw a few Agile practices at a project. Simply trying to do Agile and executing on a few of those tactics without understanding why is like the idea of just trying to dress something up without understanding or changing what it really is. And without that context of Agile values and principles, it's easy for Agile implementations to wither and die. And that fact, ladies and gentlemen, means that knowing more about these values and principles will help us out, and we're going to talk about those next. So the Agile Manifesto is something that I've talked about a little bit. We have talked about the fact that when Agile was first coming around, because software engineers had problems with the waterfall methods, I mentioned that things had started to change in the 80s and 90s. By the 1990s, things had started to change, and numerous Agile methods had emerged and started to become popular. And in 2001, a group of 17 advocates for these various methods got together in Snowbird, Utah, and they drafted a document that would establish the organizing principles for Agile. Essentially, this document started to pull together all of the things that these different methodologies had in common. So they defined an Agile Manifesto of values to encourage better ways of developing software, and they also formulated a collection of principles to help define the criteria for Agile projects. Now, when you read the Agile Manifesto, you're going to notice that it's pretty high level, and that's because Agile methodologies agree on the big picture, but the specifics can vary from one Agile methodology to another. So let's take a look. It says, through this work, we have come to value the following. We're going to start with individuals and interactions over processes and tools. This first value pair is recognizing that we should focus the team's attention on the individuals and interactions involved. Now, of course, we're still going to need tools and processes, but projects are ultimately about people. And this reminds us of where we need to focus our time and attention. The second set of values is we value working software, and I'm taking some liberty here to add products, over comprehensive documentation. Now, I'm smiling as I say this, but this is a very welcome value because most project teams don't like to write a lot of documentation. The value of working products, systems, and services really supports the whole objective of your project. Now, a document certainly can help describe what's needed, but nothing speaks louder than a working product, system, or service. But the story doesn't quite end there, because documentation is helpful on a lot of projects, and that's because project teams can change and memory is short. So Agile experts have wrestled with this, and they've come to the conclusion that the way that they'll handle it is through something called barely sufficient documentation. The rule regarding documentation is to drive our decisions about documentation is that it has to be directly connected to the value that it provides the customer, and that is sufficient. The next value pair is customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and the point of this pair is that the closer you are to your customer, the better. The customer is the best person to specify what he or she wants, even when that involves trial and error. When I think about this, I like the perspective that the author Andy Crow has about this. He said, you don't want to be pitted against your customer on opposite sides of the table, trying to punish them for adding changes to your project or trying to haggle a contract. Instead, Andy says you should visualize yourself on the same side of the table with your customer and trying to have collaborative decisions about how to move forward. Now, this pair doesn't mean that there won't be a contract and that there won't be negotiation. It just means that we'd rather spend our energy pulling in the same direction as our customer. The last value pair is that we value responding to change over following a plan. And we have to keep in mind that Agile was created to work with knowledge-based projects. And we know that the very nature of these projects is that they're going to change. So instead of us trying to suppress changes and spending a whole lot of time managing and tracking a static plan, we need to acknowledge that things will change. Now, this doesn't mean that we abandon planning and we just react to change, but it does mean that we should acknowledge that our plans were made when we knew the least about our project, and those plans will likely need to be updated as the plan progresses. Now, in addition to those four values, we've got some principles that were mentioned as we're trying to be Agile instead of doing Agile. So let's go through those as well. And I've got the original, and then I've got some interpretations of each of those principles. Principle 1, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. and I've added components, products, systems, or services. So the 3 words to zero in here, on here are early, continuous, and valuable. And you should expect to see those concepts repeatedly in an Agile environment. This is really, if I were to summarize, this is really about customer satisfaction, no matter what the deliverable of your project is. Agile teams strive to get working products into the hands of our customers fast, and we update them often. And the items that we deliver are prioritized by the value that they bring to the customer. Our second value is here. We welcome changing requirements even late in development. We harness change for the customer's competitive advantage. And this represents a significant departure from traditional waterfall project management, which looks at changing requirements as being problematic. Agile views this very differently. In Agile, we expect the requirements are going to change, and we actually welcome those changes, even if they occur late in the project. You have to keep in mind that responding quickly to change and being able to adapt to it can give your customers competitive advantage to emerging opportunities. This is a hard value for traditional project managers to embrace, but it's a very important component of success with Agile. Our third principle is to deliver working software, components, products, systems, or services from a couple of weeks to a couple of months with a preference for the shorter time scale. So there are several different Agile methodologies with many different iteration cycles, but all of them are relatively short. And whatever the length, the point is to get working products and systems into the hands of the customers quickly and get them to use that product so that you get meaningful feedback. Shorter iterations provide an important element of structure to help the project team move forward, and it's a way to help provide some of that continual disciplined focus on customer value. The fourth principle is business people and developers must work together daily throughout the project. And I kind of chuckle at this one because there was a time when projects actually segregated the people responsible for understanding the business value of the project and the people who were responsible for developing the solution. And the thinking was that each one of those two groups could do their thing and go about their business, what they did best. And then we would have business analysts and project managers help fill in the gaps. Well, Agile projects do away with this by bringing the customer and the solution developers together and often having them work in the same physical space. So this ensures that there's no gap between the people who are developing the product and the solution and the business folks who will be using it. So this reinforces the goal of delivering working systems to the customer, which are intended to deliver value to those customers. Our fifth principle is building projects around motivated individuals, giving them the support that they need and trusting them to get the job done. And this sounds like common sense, but in many cases, traditional project management had earned a reputation for micromanaging employees, telling team members how to do something and not just what to do. This top-down and command and control approach to leadership is nowhere to be found in Agile. Instead, Agile works to build a solid team. They provide them with autonomy, and they avoid micromanaging. This is simply recognizing that teams do their best work when they're allowed to make many of the day-to-day decisions and perform local planning for the project. Principle 6, the most efficient and effective method of conveying information to and within a development team is face-to-face conversation. An informal oral communication is much more popular on Agile projects than formal written communication is. The idea is that people sitting down and having a conversation and working together on a solution are more effective than if they're emailing information back and forth, or God forbid, whether they're exchanging paper documents. So face-to-face communications is considered high bandwidth communication, and it's at the very backbone of Agile projects. Unlike traditional project management environments where a lot of communication can take place in breakout rooms, in Agile, our communications take place out in the open, and everybody's got access to the conversation. Our seventh principle is working software, and I've added some things here, components, products, systems, or services. Working software is the primary measure of progress. So plans and documents might be useful, but when those plans change, those documents probably lose much of their value. In traditional project management, maybe some of you have seen some project teams get so obsessed with documentation and keeping it up to date that the documentation actually becomes a liability. But real value on an Agile project is going to be expressed through results. And results are expressed through products, systems, and services that work. They meet objectives and they work. So those are going to be our metrics in an Agile environment. Our 8th principle is Agile processes promote sustainable development. The sponsors, developers, and users should be able to maintain a constant pace indefinitely. And in this case, the sustainable development that the authors are talking about is the team. While many traditional projects have a big push at the end of the project, like I talked about earlier, where the team works late hours and weekends, Agile teams do this differently. It's very likely that your Agile project is going to have a greater overall level of intensity than other projects, but in Agile, we attempt to keep a steady, uniform, sustainable pace of work so that there aren't intense pushes at the end of the iterations and cycles. The ideal goal is to keep a pace that could be sustained indefinitely and that team members don't experience burnout or exhaustion. Our 9th principle is continuous attention to technical excellence, and good design enhances agility. Now, this principle doesn't really require a whole lot of explanation. The better the design, the easier it's going to be to maintain and even change. So that makes sense. But what this principle is also calling for is the need for something called refactoring. And we talk about this in the classroom, but this is the housekeeping, the cleanup, and the simplifications that are needed to keep our project and our product easily maintained and stable in the long run. Principle number 10, simplicity. The art of maximizing the amount of work not done is essential. And this principle is embraced by all Agile methodologies, but especially by Lean. The key is to maintain a consistent focus on customer value and then to be absolutely ruthless about cutting activities that don't add value. So think about it this way. Complex projects take longer to complete. Complex projects have more risk. They have more potential failure points. They have more opportunities for cost overruns. And in an Agile environment, you'll often hear the phrase, we're seeking the simplest thing that can possibly work, and then we're going to recommend that that simple solution be built first. This helps to mitigate risk, and it also builds customer confidence. Our 11th principle is the best architectures, requirements, and designs emerge from self-organizing teams. And the idea of self-organization is one of the core components of an Agile team. When a team is self-organizing, it means that the team decides how work is allocated. It means the team decides who's going to work on particular components on the project. This also means that the team has got to be cross-functional as well, because you have to be able to wear many hats on an Agile project. Perhaps one day you're a designer, the next iteration you might be the analyst or the writer or the tester. We've got to be able to wear multiple hats on an Agile project. So the concept of this self-organizing and cross-functional team is one of the most significant differences between traditional project management and an Agile project management team. The last principle is at regular intervals, the team is going to reflect on how to become more effective, and we're going to tune and adjust our behavior accordingly. And the one thing that's predictable on Agile is change. In traditional project management, it's common to have a postmortem or a retrospective meeting at the end of the project to use for reflection. But Agile tries to accomplish this more frequently by running retrospectives at the end of each one of those short iterations that we talked about in the 3rd principle. In Agile environments, the team looks at the work that was accomplished just in the last iteration, in the last 2 weeks. And we're working to streamline and evaluate how to improve those practices going forward. Now, as we think about putting those principles into practice, there are several Agile methodologies that we can use to illustrate their application. But one of the largest segments of the Agile market is called Scrum. So that's probably a logical methodology to talk about next. So Scrum is an Agile methodology that's been around since the early 1990s. It's not a standardized process or a checklist where I can give you a list of things to do and you're going to check the box and you're automatically delivering on time and under budget. But it is an iterative methodology, meaning that we're going to execute the project activities in short repeating cycles as we saw earlier in the presentation. And even though we are repeating the cycles, that doesn't mean that each one is identical, because remember, that last principle was talking about the changes that we're going to make at the end of each iteration. So we know that these improvements and small changes are going to result in greater efficiency and an overall smoother workflow. So let's take a look at a graphical overview of what Scrum looks like. And here we have it, the entire overview of the Scrum practice. And this session today, we're just going to walk through at a high level the various components. But as I go through this, I'd like you to keep an eye out for some of those principles and values that we talked about just earlier from the Agile Manifesto. So I'd like to start by talking about the key roles that are at the center of this diagram. I'm going to show you that we've got someone with the title of a product owner. We've got a Scrum Master or a coach, and then we've got a development team. So at the very beginning of a Scrum project, we're going to take a closer look at what's going on here. We've got a person with the title of product owner. And this individual is going to present an overall vision for the project or the product to the rest of the team. This product owner represents the voice of the end users and represents the folks who will actually be using whatever this product is. So the product vision is communicated to the team, and the product owner is going to discuss and focus in on what that product, system, or service is going to do. And because that overall vision is large, the product owner needs to break that vision down into features or user stories, which are then prioritized through a process called grooming or refining. And the prioritized list is going to be called the product backlog. Now, the priority of the items in the product backlog is determined by the product owner, and he or she is going to determine the priority based on what would deliver the highest value to the customer. And it's expected that the priorities in this product backlog are going to change. And that's perfectly fine, because remember, Agile actually embraces change. At this point, the team is going to begin something known as a sprint, and sometimes this is referred to as an iteration. A sprint is a time-boxed iteration of 1 month or less, and most Scrum sprints are 2 weeks long. So the sprint planning meeting is actually going to be broken down into 2 segments. And in the first half of the meeting, the product owner is going to discuss the highest priority items from his or her product backlog. The team is going to be engaged, they're going to ask questions. And the second half of the meeting is where the team is going to be mapping out the building, the construction of those features down to the task level. So here the team members are creating a second backlog called the sprint backlog, and this is going to describe all of the detailed work that they need to accomplish to build those features. From this point, sprint execution begins. And during the sprint execution, the team is doing their daily work in an iterative fashion. They're completing their tasks, they're building the features. And every day of that sprint execution, there's a special meeting that's held called the daily stand-up or the daily scrum. This is a meeting that takes place at the same time, in the same place, and it's limited to 15 minutes. And the team works their way around the room, and everybody working on the project answers 3 questions. What have you worked on since our last meeting toward the sprint goal? What are you working on today toward the sprint goal? And what obstacles are you encountering? So those would be taken offline by the Scrum Master and dealt with, but this is your way to communicate to your project team members where things are. This execution phase of a sprint will end with the team building a potentially shippable product increment of the product. And although the functionality might not be complete in every way, this potentially shippable increment should be functional and tested. Now, the product owner can make a decision here. The product owner can decide whether to release this to the users or whether it will be bundled together with other shippable increments and released as a release. After we've built the potentially shippable increment, we're going to go into 2 inspect and adapt activities. And the first of these 2 inspect and adapt activities is called a sprint review. And this is where we're demonstrating what we built to the key stakeholders, the product owner, and anyone else who's interested. The purpose is to showcase the new functionality and to allow the stakeholders to inspect the product being built and maybe get some new ideas about what to add to our next iteration. That meeting is going to be followed by a sprint retrospective. And this is an opportunity for the team and the Scrum Master to take a look at the processes that were used in this last iteration and make decisions about how to tune their development process. We're taking a look at what worked well, what needs to change, and what needs adjustment. So the outcome of these inspect and adapt processes might be new features or new practices that the team is going to use moving forward, and then we restart the cycle. So earlier I mentioned that Agile practitioners will refer to Scrum as a framework for organizing and managing their work, and I hope that's clearer after that quick overview. But I got to be honest with you, ladies and gentlemen, at this point in the classroom, I get a lot of folks who say, okay, I get it now. I understand what Scrum is. Thanks for the explanation. But it's not going to work for me or my department. You see, I don't want to uproot everything that I'm doing now. I'm not interested in trying to fill new roles like a product owner and a Scrum Master. And I don't think our work can be broken down into these nice little 2-week chunks of work. And so I'm not thinking that this is going to work for me. And that's okay. That's okay, because there are several ways, several methods to approach this idea of being agile. So I'd like to talk about one more way that we can put those principles into practice. And we can do this without the emphasis on iterations and sprints. And that's done through the Kanban technique. So Kanban is a Japanese term for visual signal, and the Kanban methodology actually dates back 50 years into the manufacturing environment. And historically, Kanban was used to align inventory with the consumption of materials. But today's Agile teams are able to use those exact same ideas by matching the amount of work in progress, or WIP, with the team's capacity. And this gives teams more flexibility in planning. It generates faster output. It makes the focus of your project clearer and allows greater transparency through the development process. And you'll also see that Kanban methodology in Agile is far less structured than what we just saw in Scrum. So a Kanban board is an Agile project management tool that's designed to help you visualize work. It helps you limit and control the amount of work in progress in your project, and it helps to maximize efficiency or flow of your project. So the work of a Kanban team revolves around these Kanban boards, and they look something like this. And this example shows our work items, our user stories and features on cards in each stage of a production process that's been defined by the team. The main purpose of presenting our work on a card on the Kanban board is to allow the team members to track the progress of work as it's going through each element of the workflow in a highly visual manner. As work progresses, it passes through each cycle, each stage. As I'm showing here, the cards get moved from one column to another throughout the process. So those Kanban cards include critical information about that particular work item, giving the entire team full visibility to things like who's responsible, how much work is planned, and a description of the job being done. Kanban operates on 5 specific principles that I'll cover quickly. And those principles are that we visualize the workflow. And this is an important idea for organizing and tracking our work. I want you to think about that for a moment, ladies and gentlemen. Our knowledge work projects typically have invisible and intangible work items. So being able to see our work items on a Kanban board is a great way to visualize those invisible and intangible things. We also need to limit work in progress because it improves focus and productivity. And it increases our visibility to bottlenecks and issues. So we're more easily able to spot the things that are hanging up our work items. So this helps us to make sure that the teams aren't biting off more than they can chew. We're not committing to too much work. And that's actually a cornerstone of Kanban. We always want to remember that value is going to be determined by the things that we finish and not the number of things that we start. If I can say that another way, work in progress has cost, but no value. So do you see these numbers at the top of each one of the columns that I've highlighted? These are limits for the amount of work that's allowable in each column. The work in progress in each stage of the workflow is limited, and new work can only be pulled into those columns when there's capacity within that local work in progress limit. This helps to avoid multitasking and context switching, to avoid getting bogged down in an expanding level of work. We also need to manage flow, and really what we're talking about here is maximizing efficiency. And that means that we have to be able to track the flow of work through the system from one end of the board to another. And that can be used as a measure of effectiveness. So think about this as looking at how value is flowing from one end of the board to another, and identifying and analyzing problem areas where that flow might be getting stalled. We also need to make those process policies explicit, and that's a very fancy way of saying we just got to have open and objective discussions about those improvements that I just mentioned. You can't improve something that you don't understand, and that means that our processes need to be defined and published and socialized. And when everyone really understands what it is that you're doing, well, then you can start to make decisions regarding changes that are going to move you in a positive direction. And we make those changes by improving collaboratively, by owning and improving the processes being used. Kanban encourages small, continuous, incremental, and evolutionary changes. You might hear the term Kaizen when you read about Kanban. Kaizen is a word generally meaning continuous improvement, and Kaizen is a key part of using the Kanban methodology. So if we compare Kanban and Scrum for a minute, there are several differences that are easy to spot. First and most notably, Kanban uses a pull system to pull work items from the left side of the board to the right. And that pull approach means that Kanban has far less emphasis on sprints and iterations. So Kanban also has no prescribed roles, such as the product owner and the Scrum Master, etc. And Kanban is going to place focus and emphasis on continuous delivery of value, while in Scrum, our focus was on those time-boxed sprints of 2 weeks. And for all those reasons, this Kanban technique is frequently used in applications where it would be more challenging to implement those sprints or iterations with Scrum. And I find that many non-software applications will begin their Agile journeys with the Kanban approach. So ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up what I had intended to cover today. When we chatted at the beginning, I said that I wanted to provide a high-level introduction of Agile concepts and compare them with traditional methods. We wanted to talk about the values and principles from the Agile Manifesto, and wanted to talk about a couple of ways to put those into practice. So we're ready to turn this over for any questions that you might have had.
Well, let me begin by thanking Wayne for his presentation, taking a topic that can often be confusing and creating some simple clarity around it. So thank you for that. We have questions still coming in, but I've got a couple for you to start with.
Okay.
Number one, how many types of Agile methodologies do you cover in your Agile project management classes?
That's a great question. Thank you. Currently, we cover 7 methods. So we certainly cover Scrum, because right now it represents a significant portion of the universe out there. We also talk about extreme programming, lean, Kanban. There are 3 methods that are long-time Agile methodologies. There's Crystal, there's dynamic systems development, and feature-driven design.
Great.
So we cover all 7 of those.
Thank you very much for that.
Mm-hmm.
What percentage of Agile projects are using Scrum these days?
Another great question, and I'll say that current market research is saying that approximately 55 to 58% of all Agile projects are using the Scrum methodology that I reviewed.
Thank you. Do companies ever use a hybrid approach between Agile and traditional methodologies?
Actually, that is growing in utilization. Some recent research showed that more than 60% of projects that are out there right now, running today, are using some combination of Agile and traditional methods. And the way that they break this down is you can start to see elements of the project that might be fuzzier in terms of requirements, maybe a design element, and they'll use Agile for those techniques, where maybe if there is a legal or procurement type element to the project, they will use traditional methods for that.
Right. How is emerging technology impacting the tools and approaches to Agile project management?
All right. So I'd say the emerging technology is going to impact us in a couple of different ways. So you saw in the Kanban technique that we were using cards and doing things manually. There are more and more enterprise systems that allow you to do that electronically so that you can incorporate virtual teams and you can have virtual task boards and you can share that information. So we talk about a number of software applications that can help you do that in the classroom, but some that come to mind might be Jira or version 1. I've also seen some things with Microsoft DevOps. We also have to think about new and better emerging technologies for incorporating those distributed folks together into one Agile team. I talked about face-to-face communications being important, and that's really difficult when your team is scattered around the globe. But with advances in video conferencing and telepresence, that's making those distributed teams easier to work with in an Agile environment.
Great, great. We've got time for one more question. I think there's one more that just came over. Let me grab that one. Actually, there's two more questions.
Okay.
What does it take to get certified in Agile through PMI, and is that necessary?
Okay. So the Agile certification through PMI requires, first of all, from a training perspective, it requires 21 hours of training through a registered education provider. You would need a significant amount of experience, and let me cover that in two ways. First of all, you've got to demonstrate 2,000 hours of traditional project management experience, and that box can be checked if you have your PMP. You also need to demonstrate that you've got 1,500 hours of Agile project management experience. So those are the three items to be able to sit for the exam. And the Agile certification from PMI is a 3-hour exam, and it's going to be on the order of a PMP exam, but just shorter. Another question on that one?
Well, I have one final question.
Okay.
It's about, I am a prophet of Agile in my company. How do I create some enthusiasm around the concept?
I think that's a great question, and hopefully some of the slides that I presented about being Agile versus just doing Agile can put you on the right path to that sooner. I'm a big advocate. I like the term that you're a prophet of Agile. I like the idea of always being able to take a look at projects that didn't do so well and inviting yourself to a retrospective on those projects. You might find that when you attend a retrospective meeting and you get a chance to see some project failures, that maybe you can say, you know what, this project or this approach didn't work well because of these things that we didn't understand about the project. And this might be a time for us to think about moving from traditional project management to Agile and start advocating some of those strategies that I talked about. I think that might be the best way, and I think as harsh as it sounds, it's always best to be able to start anew when there's some sort of project failure where we can point to, here's what happened, and here are some techniques that might help us in the future.
Great. Thank you, Wayne, for a great session. If you enjoyed today's session, we are kicking off a new program next week. It's Project Management for the Accidental Project Manager. It's on November 11th. It's a great kind of way to start to wade into the water here if either you're managing a lot of folks that are working on projects or you just want to get more inculcated into the project management, nomenclature. It's a great new program. So we have a few seats available. Think about that. Otherwise, this concludes today's fall online learning series. As I mentioned, our next session is in December with Michael Wright. It's December 11th. And the title of the session is Planning in the Era of Emerging Technology. So thanks for joining us at the University of St. Thomas. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you.